why are you defending criminals? Huh? They don't deserve it. This kind of sentiment will hold until the day that your son or daughter is the one who's being charged with something.
I mean, in light of like some of the cases that we've seen recently on the news, I mean, as a layperson, I do agree. I would vote yes on the poll. Yeah.
I think I have felt unhappiness when I see that someone who is guilty in my eyes could have gotten more of a stiffer punishment, but they got away with something that is like a slap in the wrist.
I am not surprised that the poll results are as such. But at the same time, there's a little bit in me that is kind of like not too sure, because like it all comes down, I feel it all comes down to a matter of trust in a question like this. There are a few times where I kind of question what's going on, because all I see is what happens in the news, right? And the news sometimes gives me a very poor impression of how the judicial system handles cases in Singapore. I try to be as moderate and objective about these kind of things as possible. It's been an incredibly long time since the first police report was made until the time when she is acquitted, and it's like a large proportion it's like incriminating towards her.
I think the results of the poll is just a reflection of public perception, but this public perception, I think, more often than not, is maybe shaped by the lack of information. It's rare to get a country where you have many different people from many different ethnicities, and you can have a judge who's a Chinese and a person who's accused who's from a different race, and we can have people who go through the process and have full confidence that whatever it is the outcome, it is outcomes that are based on laws, based on clear precedents, based on clear rules of what has happened and what should happen in any criminal hearing or in any criminal trial. So I would say, being a practitioner for quite some time now, I have full confidence in the system. Since you brought up the Parti Liyani case, the other day I was having a discussion about this with people who had nothing to do with the law, right? And they were under the impression that this entire case was something between the family and Parti Liyani. What happened was the family made a police report. They made the allegation that she had taken some of their things, and then the rest is left to the system. So the one that is going against her apologies in court is not the family, but it is the state. When you read commentaries, it can be skewed in a certain way such that you believe that the criminal justice system becomes part of this family that is going against her, and because of that, naturally anyone would come to that conclusion that, oh, if you're rich you can get your way with these kind of things, but it's not the case.
So why do you think people's first reaction is to look at it as something between rich and poor?
I think the perception will come about when people think and try and compare a poor person who is accused of a crime and a rich person who's accused of a crime. And this comes about because lawyers cost money. And so naturally, a poor person who is accused of a crime perhaps doesn't have the same level of access to lawyers as a more wealthy person, both in terms of choice of representation, as well as whether you can even get a lawyer, whether there's a pro bono lawyer willing to step forward. So perhaps that comes from, are you able to get a good lawyer to act for you? But that leads us to a second question, which is, should your guilt or innocence in the courts actually depend on how good your lawyer is? There was one particular case which I was handling quite early on in my career, a criminal case, and I genuinely believed that my client was innocent and that the evidence was all in our favor. Unfortunately, when the verdict was handed down by the district judge, it was a conviction, and the sentence as well was fairly heavy. As I've seen more cases over the years, I've sort of rationalized how the judges make their decisions, and as well as which are the cases that we need to take up on appeal. I would say on balance, I think the criminal justice system currently that we have is quite fair and balanced.
I think a lot of the time that is the, how to say, common sentiment that people have, that like how innocent you are is determined by how good your lawyer is. is I don't know, is that true or is that Hollywood?
In any case, we must understand in Singapore we have the adversarial system. Right?
Which is
An adversarial system basically means when you enter court, you really need to put your best foot forward. So therefore, by virtue of this adversarial system, the quality of your lawyer, who you get to represent you and all that is definitely going to have an impact. And anyone who says otherwise, I think is just being either naive or not realistic. This outcome, what happened in this case, to me, is testament to the fact that access to justice is there. And if you look hard enough to get a good lawyer, you will get a good lawyer. And it's not a question about about how deep your pockets are, but maybe it's about how hard you work to find that relevant lawyer who has experience, the capability and the bandwidth to take on your case.
We can say that you can try really hard to find a lawyer, but maybe it's easier for some people to find a lawyer in the first place, like a really big, rich family who maybe didn't have to look that far, or like maybe the lawyer is like just a phone call away, you know.
I mean, because of by virtue of it being an adversarial system, isn't it kind of unfair?
I think that's a very valid point, but we should also recognize that to a large extent that is ameliorated by pro bono legal services, because an accused person who can't pick up the phone and call a lawyer, she would nonetheless be informed that there are pro bono lawyers available. There's a criminal legal aid scheme. This would be offered to that person quite early on in the court process.
We must walk away from this misconception that yes, this rich family definitely would have access to lawyers just a phone call away. The rich family had nothing to do with the prosecution of the case. They did not need to have to employ any lawyers for themselves. So that much we must be clear of, and we need to walk away and step away from the perception that it is a rich family hiring lawyers to go after a poor person. That's not the case.
What about all the cases that people don't hear about? What about all those that don't make the headlines?
If I were to just take a page from what our Minister Shanmugam mentioned, to me he acknowledged the fact that perhaps in the prosecutorial process, in the investigative process, there may have been lapses that led to the outcome that is currently the case. I would agree that there may be many other cases that don't get the same public exposure, but that doesn't mean that the outcomes are any less fair. If anything, the fact that there wasn't exposure would probably mean that the outcomes were acceptable and it didn't have to be reported or discussed at length.
The perception of A versus B comes about when you have a district judge, a trial judge, trying to weigh and compare the testimonies of the Liu family versus Parti Liyani's testimony. And then he has to make an assessment, or she has to make an assessment as to who is more credible, because when the stories clash head on, someone has got to be lying.
Responsible reporting has a lot to do with this, and sometimes headlines are unnecessarily sensationalized to the effect that the perception may be swayed in not a fair way, I would say.
So can I just ask whether the state courts and the high courts, right, do they go through the same processes in
It's quite different. So the evidence has all been taken at the state court level. What then happens on appeal in the high court, usually it's a half-day hearing where the judge goes through the entire record of appeal. So everything that's been classified in the state courts is reduced in writing. There are transcripts recorded verbatim. He goes through that. He goes through the submissions of the prosecution and the defense in the court below. He looks at the exhibits, and then he comes to his own conclusion as to whether the trial judge was right.
It's a hierarchy of courts, and each ascension means a higher level matter. There are some criminal matters that start off in the high court, usually capital matters or certain higher level offences immediately start at the high court level. And if there's an appeal from that, it'll go straight to the court of appeal. In this particular case, it was a matter that was first heard at the state courts level.
which is for like theft, right?
Yes. The trial process is a lot like what you see on TV, right? Somebody takes a stand, they sit down, one lawyer will ask questions, the other lawyer. So it's something similar to what you see on TV, but that whole process takes place at the state court level. When it goes on appeal, in the appeal, what the judge needs to decide on is whether or not there was an error of either law or an error of fact that must have taken place at the lower court that will warrant a change in the outcome.
So it's just a reanalysis at a higher level.
Yep, arguably yes.
I think, to put it very simply, why the district judge and the High Court judge reached such starkly different decisions. You're talking about a case that's decided by one judge. And the reality is, sometimes judges do get things wrong. And so the High Court judge, essentially formed the view that the decision was wrong.
Is there like anything higher than a High Court judge? Like
So
someone...
the next level will be the Court of Appeal, but that's the last level.
So there's no one like checking whether the High Court judge is making the correct judgment?
If a case has started out in the High Court, then you have a right to bring an appeal to the Court of Appeal, where you'll be heard actually by at least 3 judges. If a case has started out in the state courts, then your right of appeal is only up to the High Court, unless you can show a very exceptional public interest element for why you should be allowed to go one more level higher to the Court of Appeal.
What would you say to someone who really just strongly feels that she shouldn't have gone through the 4 years of this legal battle in courts, because now there's an argument about how she had to struggle a lot and there's no justice in that?
Any person who goes through any form of criminal investigation arguably would be going through an ordeal. The process is not easy. You're interrogated by policemen. You need to go through the ups and downs, your own internal emotional battles. But this is the case in any criminal matter. It is not as if Parti Liyani was alienated and subject to something that is not the case for anything else. But the beauty of it is that the system eventually goes through the process to correct anything that may or may not be correct. Now, as mentioned earlier in the ministerial statements, issues of investigation and perhaps discretion in prosecution, these are things that may be revisited and may be handled with internally in the ministry and whatnot. But essentially, as what was discussed just now, this case proves the fact that the system works. And if you go through the process and if you are meant to walk away, you will walk away.
Most people agree.
For people who are basically the deceased in a murder case.
Actually, to be very honest, I didn't really think about that until you all did the poll. And I feel like that speaks a lot to like public knowledge also.
Like, should the deceased in a murder situation, be given legal representation? If, let's say, based on the news, there were things that were disputed, like certain participants of the case, had their sentences reduced because of on the grounds of things like remorse and things like that. Whereas who represents the opposing emotion? Because remorse is something that is not objective, right? And like, who represents the opposite end of this for the deceased? Personally, I feel that it is deeply unfair, because like in a situation like this where a life is lost, right? And in a country like Singapore where as a citizen I empower the state to fix issues like this in a way that is, I hesitate to say this, but in a way that is satisfactory in the eyes of society. But at the same time, it doesn't sit right with me that people involved in a violent situation like this with evidence that is caught on video, and then we see and stuff like that, and then a large proportion of them are sort of acquitted of the capital charge. Not that I wish the capital charge on anyone, but acquitted of the capital charge purely because the penal code is as such. Like, as much as it covers fairly, objectively and from a lot of angles, it just doesn't, I feel it isn't fair to the family of the deceased. And the thing that irks me even more is that the deceased cannot be the one that delivers this point,
There's like a video of it on YouTube that I watched, and it was quite jarring, because I know Natalie Xiao, the girl. I think after Satish, the victim, collapsed, she actually went back to collect her slipper.
Yeah.
And then I'm just like, oh my gosh, how much, like, do you have no empathy? Like, what is going on? Or maybe she was just drunk, you know? So, like, I don't know, like, when I saw the video, it made me feel like they could have gotten more punishment.
I feel there's a grave injustice that was
Yeah.
done. Someone is lying in a
Full of blood.
pool of his own blood, and
You walk
the
past him.
perpetrator come back to take the slipper and
Yes.
leave.
And it's all on video for everyone to see.
Yeah, this just
Yeah.
doesn't sit right.
You see, murder victims don't need to be represented. It's a question of people who commit the murder, who would be charged in court, right? The murder victims, technically, there's no requirement for legal representation. But if, for example, if there's a bereavement claim or if there's a claim for damages against who caused it and whatnot, of course, from a legal perspective, that is possible, but I've never heard of it and ever been done. Have you ever heard of it?
In fact, yes. If you recall, there was an accident involving
Accidents.
taxi driver.
Yes.
And someone passed away. I think there were prosecutions, and after that, the family of the deceased as well brought a legal claim. So the avenue is there.
Yep.
I think when we unpack this question, what people really are feeling is that they do not think perhaps the punishment that has been meted out to the accused persons is adequate.
Now, when I first read it, my view was, as a practicing lawyer, I was wondering why the prosecution decided to reduce the charges to that of voluntarily causing hurt. And for example, you might wonder why not grievous hurt, right?
Mm-hmm.
And later, the AGC did release clarification, and they did explain to say that in the circumstances, whatever action that person had taken, like for her, it was pushing off the victim and all that, that could not have amounted to any more than hurt.
A decision was made very early on to charge many people, I think 7 if I'm not wrong, with murder. Sometimes there's good reason to do this because the police need to have that charge so that they can hold those people in police custody and complete investigations and then find out exactly what happened. And once they have a clearer idea of what has happened, then they relook at the charges again, and then they sort of bring a more appropriate charge against particular individuals. But because the public has already had this thought that, oh, there's been 7 people charged with murder, how come some of them are now facing lesser charges?
Because something like this will have sort of effects on my future perceptions on how murder situations are handled, you know. And I don't know, I just can't quite come to terms with this kind of things. This man was left to die, essentially. How does the criminal justice system in Singapore then cover that kind of reaction when you see someone that you were involved in an altercation already, in a pool of his own blood, and then no empathy to help, nothing. I just go back to my sleeper and leave. This does not sit well with me.
It's easy to say populist things and pull at our heartstrings and say, oh my god, this person is so evil, this, that. Then we are going to devolve into the court of public perception. Then we might as well just throw away the entire criminal justice process. Why we have the criminal justice process is we believe that every person deserves a fair day in court. I don't know how much you get it, but I get it all the time. Why are you defending criminals? They don't deserve it. This kind of sentiment will hold until the day that your son or daughter is the one who's being charged with something. And for each case has to be determined on its facts. Each case has to be determined on the extent of the involvement, on what happened, on what actually transpired, not on our emotions.
How do you defend someone who is, in the eyes of people, guilty in that case? Yeah.
So, the eyes of people, that's irrelevant in court.
Right.
Now, if that person in question has come and told me he is guilty, he didn't do this, then there wouldn't be a trial, as far as I'm concerned. I would tell him, you need to plead guilty. Then the issue becomes what should be the most appropriate and fair sentence for that person.
Compare this to our earlier discussion. If you were to be painted with the same lenses and we don't know anything about what happened in the High Court, can we say the same thing about Parti Liyani? Do we then say, oh, Parti Liyani stole things, she doesn't deserve a lawyer? that can't be the case, right?
Mm.
Whoever it is that you are, whatever it is that you're charged with, you deserve the best legal representation that you can get. So it's not for us to say just because a heinous crime was committed, he should not get a lawyer to represent.
I don't know how related this is to the, what was it that was mentioned, the court of public opinion? Is that it? Is that linked to having a jury?
This is entirely just a memory. There was a jury system but it was abolished, if my recollection is correct. But at that point in time, the entire abolishment of the jury system would have been something that would have been discussed and decided on by the lawmakers of that time.
When some wrong has been done to you, your primal instinct is you want retribution for the person who inflicted that upon you. If someone has passed away, you have a primal instinct, you want to seek revenge.
Mm.
Is that one of the aims of the criminal justice system? Yes, it is, but it's one of four. There are other aims of the criminal justice system. One of them is rehabilitation. There are deterrent aims as well. If a life has already been lost, do we want to take away another?
You mentioned how then do we get the voice of the victim, whether it's a person who passed away or was murdered or whatnot, or any other criminal charge. How do we get the voice of the victim? Well, the prosecution often in criminal cases would avail themselves of what is called victim impact statements. In any different scenario, for example, someone's life is lost. Who is suffering? His family? Was he the sole breadwinner? Does he have young children? How young or old is he? Could he have had a long life? Who were his dependents? All of these things could be born out of such impact statements. And again, it's up to the prosecution to bring it before court.
Do y'all think, personally as practicing lawyers, right, that public perception, like the kind of polls that we do, right, is it a good indicator of the level of trust citizens have of the criminal justice system?
I think in Singapore, right, we have a very reasonable population. We have a good set of minds, and this is probably born out of a good education system. But we must understand that public opinion can only be shaped by the access to information and knowledge and understanding of what goes on. If you poll 100 people about whether it's good to go for chemotherapy or radiotherapy, no one's going to know if they're not doctors, for example.
I think responsible journalism has a huge role to play in this, shaping public perception as well as access to alternative voices of the media, as long as the factual bases are all accurate.
I was honestly very overwhelmed. There was a lot of noise, and it felt like the media was telling me how to think.
I think what Roman mentioned about how everyone deserves a fair day in court is something that is important to me, because I think this is something that as a society sometimes we neglect to think about from the perpetrator's point of view. Even now, having rationalized it, it still feels incredibly unfair to me, and this is not something that I would say is on the fault of the criminal justice system.
So is there ever a place for emotions in any case, I guess?
I think emotions are definitely relevant because emotions are part of being human, and being human is what we need to hold supreme, right? Because what is a body of laws without the fact that this body of laws apply to human beings?
Emotions are the very center of human experience, so they are important. But when you talk about a crime has been committed, the deed has been done. What next? Whose emotions should we be looking at? And that's why the courts have taken into account remorse. That's a relevant emotion.
I'm wondering if in Singapore courts we record our court proceedings. The reason why I ask is because I realize a lot of these cases we are sort of receiving it through a media, secondhand,
Yeah.
right? Through the media.
The best source is actually the court judgment. If there's a written grounds of decision, read that. as far as you're talking about High Court and Court of Appeal judgments, the Supreme Court website is very updated. Everything that comes out on a day-to-day basis will be there, and I think they archived it quite a few years back, so that's available. Now, as far as the district court judgments are concerned, they are not available unless you subscribe to Lawnet. You could very well go on to the Supreme Court website, search for Parti Liyani. You can read the High Court judgment as well.
It's very easy to feel angry and feel that the justice system is not fair. It's really important to take a step back and just, you know, ground yourself, ground myself. And also go to the Supreme Court website, you know? read the
Just
source.
plug it in here.
Yeah, just go to the Supreme Court website.
Yeah.
It definitely helps having two practitioners here to actually tell me firsthand how it works. I could look at it online, but I feel like there might be still things that are just more difficult to understand and easier to clarify in person.
Well, if it helps, I certainly trust the criminal justice system. But can it be improved? Certainly. I think it's always a work in progress, and it's the responsibility of all the stakeholders to work towards that.
I wouldn't say that, like you mentioned, I wouldn't say that there was mistrust, you know, on my part as well. But the thing about it is that it has further reaffirmed the parts that I agree with, you know, in the court of law. So like what thing you mentioned about how there is a lot to still be improved upon, you know, because it is a system after all, and it's based around people, and it should always be improving. I now feel that like that sentiment is something that I trust as well.